Why don't digital technologies always quickly translate into productivity growth? What if the technology and your business model doesn't quite fit? How should leaders think differently when adopting AI, automation, or platforms? And why does measurement matter more than ever? We are going to find out. Welcome to Productivity Puzzles, Ask the Expert. Hello and welcome to Productivity Puzzles. My name is Bart van Ark and I'm a professor of productivity studies at the University of Manchester and the director of the Productivity Institute, a UK-wide research body focused on all things productivity in the UK and beyond. This is the second of 5 short episodes which we are releasing during National Productivity Week 2026. Each one a conversation with an expert exploring how productivity shapes better outcomes for firms, people and places. Format is simple, 15 minutes of discussion with my guest and then followed by 15 minutes of your questions. So if you're watching live, drop your questions wherever you normally do. And for everything else happening this week also, visit productivityweek.co.uk or our home at productivity.ac.uk. Today, and actually also tomorrow, we're focusing on digital technology. AI may dominate the headlines, but digitalization has shaped innovation for decades. And our question today is how digitalization has changed and continues to change the way that firms innovate. While disruptive technologies are not new, today's wave seems faster, it seems more pervasive, and crucially, it does not automatically deliver the productivity gains that many expect. So this challenge is at the heart of the productivity puzzle, and at the Productivity Institute, we've spent a great deal of time exploring it. For the business perspectives, we're therefore delighted to be joined today by our resident expert on business model innovation, Professor Chander Velu. Chander is a professor of innovation and economics at the University of Cambridge in the Institute for Manufacturing, and his research focuses on business model innovation, digital transformation and productivity, and he advises organizations worldwide on turning emerging technologies into sustainable economic value. Chander, welcome this Tuesday morning on this webinar.
Good morning, Bart. Delighted to be here this morning. Thank you.
Fantastic. And as listeners will know or viewers will see, this is a webinar, but it will be turned into a podcast later today. So if there are other people that you would like to listen to this, which I'm sure will be a great conversation, then please let them know. Now, maybe, Chander, we should start with a term that we're kicking around a lot at the Productivity Institute, which is called the productivity paradox. What exactly is the productivity paradox? What does it mean when we think about innovation rather than just technology itself?
Yeah, the productivity paradox relates to an anomaly that we observe when new general purpose technologies come on board that is meant to improve efficiency of firms and organizations. But it turns out that it doesn't show up immediately anyway in growth rates in terms of productivity and economic growth. And this has been an anomaly that we've been observing across various general purpose technologies. So for example, we went back in time to look at the late 19th century where electric motors were replacing steam engines. We see this observation that productivity growth rate slows down before it takes off. Or when digital computers came on board to be adopted by firms, perhaps late 60s, 1970s, and so on and so forth. Again, we see the same trend of slowdown in productivity growth rate before it takes off. And more recently, we've observed it over the last 15, 20 years or so. And this is known as the productivity paradox. And economists have been talking about the reasons, and there could be several reasons. There could be mismatch in skills. It could be the diffusion of technology, the rate at which technology diffuses. Maybe larger firms adopt them faster than smaller firms. It could be measurement issues in the digital economy, or it could be the financial crisis working its way through, and maybe even lack of business model innovation following the adoption of digital technology that could possibly explain some of these productivity paradoxes.
Yeah, and it's that last element, which is sort of the unique perspective that you are taking on the issue. So how important is it for firms to innovate their business model as they adopt these digital technologies so that they can gain the benefit from productivity growth?
Yes, I think the key premise is, in order to have productivity growth, one needs to innovate the business model, the core processes within firms. For example, if we go back in time and have a look at the emergence of digital computers, a firm like Walmart, if you take Walmart as an example, a large grocery retailer in the US, it was investing quite heavily in some of these digital computers back in the perhaps in the late 70s, early 80s, and so on and so forth. But they didn't really see productivity growth rate until they also enabled their supply chain to also adopt some of these digital computers, and they transformed the core processes around how inventory is managed across the entire supply chain, so that the entire supply chain could see through in terms of Walmart's inventory and therefore not overproduce or underproduce, and that only then did productivity growth rate really take off, so to speak. And similarly, organizations need to think about not only adopting some of these digital technologies to improve the existing processes or the efficiency of the existing processes, but how to transform the core processes, the business model, create new customer value propositions, and that's when real productivity growth rate takes off, so to speak.
And why is it that this has become more of an issue, you think, under artificial intelligence, sort of the latest wave of new technologies, compared to previous phase of digital transformation? As I said before, it's always been there, these kind of problems, but it seems it's a bigger issue right now.
Yeah. And I think it's partly because some of these newer technologies is easier, I suppose, to incorporate into existing processes, i.e. if you look at AI and so on and so forth, there are readily available models that can be incorporated into existing processes in order to try to improve the efficiency of the processes. But typically what happens is when firms think about improving the efficiency, I suppose they do not focus on the knock-on effects across other parts of the business. And the business model can, over time, become less and less efficient because one particular process improves, but not the overall business model itself. And therefore, that could also contribute to productivity declines or productivity slowdown, so to speak. And I think that's one big difference compared to previous generation technologies, where it probably is hardware driven. And some of these software, digital-based technologies can be incorporated into existing processes relatively easily to improve efficiency. But one needs to step back and think about how to redesign the core process to really get the productivity uptake.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting conundrum, right? So on the one hand, it looks like it's really easy to get AI software integrated because you already got the hardware, but then the journey really starts. And that really goes to this concept of what you call business model incoherence.
Yeah.
And that is that, you can have this new technology here, but then it puts a lot of pressure on what you're going to do with your business model and how you're going to innovate. So could you provide some examples, maybe across manufacturing and services industries, of how business model incoherence can arise?
Yeah. So what happens it's a very, very interesting issue with a lot of firms. So if one were to look at large organizations, the responsibility typically sits at a functional level. I.e., each function has got a head. It could be a head of manufacturing, it could be the head of procurement, it could be the head of marketing, and so on and so forth. And quite often, these heads of functions have particular KPIs, i.e. key performance indicators, to measure their performance. And therefore, they tend to adopt some of these technologies to improve the particular function itself, so to speak. And then that could have a wider impact across other functions. So let me give you an example. Let us say it's a manufacturing firm that produces washing machines, as an example. And these washing machines are becoming smarter in the sense that there could be sensors incorporated into them to decide when a particular part might fail and so on and so forth. And the manufacturing firms has got new technology. For example, let's say they've recently adopted additive manufacturing or 3D printing technology, so that they don't need to hold the spare parts in inventory, but they could make to order, so to speak, depending on when the customer requires it. Now, if such a technology is incorporated into the manufacturing process, there could be a knock-on effect in terms of how the procurement works, i.e. when the parts need to be ordered in. There could be a knock-on effect in terms of the distribution and marketing of the product, because it is being not ordered in stock, but made to order, so to speak. So therefore, there needs to be a reorganization of the business model of this particular firm in order to really get the benefit of this new technology, let's say 3D printing or the sensor-based technology that recognizes when the washing machine is going to break down. Now, if we then take it outside the firm into some of the service firms that may be delivering a repair service, so to speak. Now, the firm that is delivering the repair service also needs to change its business model because the parts may come in at different points in time. It could well be that some of these repair firms may get into the business of printing the parts themselves because the manufacturer doesn't need to print it centrally, but they could license it to some of these repair firms to print the parts and so on and so forth. So therefore, there needs to be a transformation of the entire business model and the ecosystem or the supply chain in order really for this productivity uptake to come through. And that's where the incoherence of the business model or across within the firm, as well as across the supply chain, both within manufacturing as well as the service firms need to take place in order for productivity growth to really come through.
Yeah, so it seems to me there's sort of, and it goes back to the earlier conundrum that we sketched, is there's kind of a low-hanging fruit part, and that is that, people use large language models to do their day-to-day job better and things like that, to, summarize work better, to make notes better, and so on and so forth. But then there's the higher hanging fruit that is the real game changer in this respect. Yes. And as I alluded to in my introductory remarks, I also mentioned that it seems that measurement is really becoming very important for this, right? Because I think if you get these complex parts that have to come together in order to make the business model more coherent, it seems that measuring is critical in order to sort of get out of this business model incoherence kind of environment. Can you talk a little bit more about what is that kind of measurement and how should firms go about that?
Yes, and measurement is critical here because unless we measure it, it's difficult to understand precisely what the incoherence is, so to speak. And we've been working quite a lot around this theme, and we've been developing a concept or a framework called the Business Model Coherence Scorecard. And the underlying premise is relatively straightforward. So if we look at most firms, the way they are managed is they tend to focus on profitability. Profitability can be measured at different levels, i.e. at the product level, at the division level, at the firm level, or even at a geographic level, and so on and so forth. And the principle of profitability measuring is to match the revenues and costs, so to speak. And that's an important concept because the question of whether the capital budgeting, i.e. how much capital should one put into the firm, how much investments, and so on and so forth, is a function of whether it makes appropriate returns. But in measuring some of these profitability at different levels, the firm suppresses the activity system, so to speak, because you're matching the revenues and costs regardless of where it's arising. And therefore, it suppresses the interrelationship between the activity systems in the firm. And going back to the earlier premise that the coherence is a result of mismatch between the different functions and activity systems within the firm. So therefore, in order to really enable measurement of the coherence of the business model, we need to have a complementary measurement system called the Business Model Coherence Scorecard. And it consists broadly of a number of key elements, so to speak. We need to understand, for example, what is the information flow within the firm, i.e. who and when is getting the right type of information. How is the material flow happening within the firm? What are the key performance indicators that the different parts of the organization is using, and who has the decision rights to make certain decisions, and who are the partners that we need to engage with in order to enable the business model to be efficient and coherent. And we can think about the Business Model Coherence Scorecard across these 5 dimensions and measure as we adopt new technology whether they are still in line or coherent with each other, so to speak, across the different activity chain. And that is a key principle of the Business Model Coherence Scorecard, which need to then complement the profitability reporting. And if firms were to manage both of these elements, then they can enable appropriate innovation to the business model or ensure business model coherence.
So that sounds complicated. So the question is, can AI itself help to actually do some of that measurement?
I think, AI may be able to contribute, so to speak, in the sense that these days, what's happening in lots of organizations is there are many different systems within the organizations. It could be a manufacturing system, it could be an ERP system, it could be a customer ordering system, it could be a procurement system. And often firms have many different systems in order to be able to manage the firm. And increasingly, what might be possible is an overlay of an AI-based system that pulls the data in from these different elements of the organization, and therefore be able to provide management with the right type of information to measure some of these incoherence that we're talking about. However, having said that, there is still an element of subjective judgment, because these are strategic decisions that firms need to take. And a lot of these AI systems is partly backward looking, whereas the future might look different in the sense that there could be competitors, there could be new technologies, and so on and so forth. So it's a question of management still being able to use some of these AI systems to help them inform the dimensions of the business model coherence scorecard, but at the same time have an element of judgment, because the future is different, so to speak.
Yeah, and I should perhaps have set up front that in the show notes, we're actually going to provide a link to the report on digitalization that you've been contributing to, and there's a further explanation of this concept of balanced scorecards and how companies can go about it. So, Chander, let's go to the questions. And again, I encourage our viewers this morning to put in questions. We've got a question in already from Tony Chen, and his question is around the 6 questions of technology that are often part of the framework that was developed in the Theory of Constraints. And these questions are designed to assess the true value of a new technology, product, or service to ensure it solves a meaningful problem, rather than just providing sophisticated features. So does AI fall in that sort of same category?
Yes, no, I absolutely. I think AI is an enhanced version. It's a continuum, i.e. what digital technologies have been doing over the past 30, 40 years is it enables the digitization of physical information, so to speak. Right? And over time, the volume of that information has increased, and I suppose the algorithms that that can enable the processing of this information has also improved, so to speak. And therefore, AI has become quite a critical element. And AI effectively, enables the diagnosis as well as the prediction, and probably is moving to being able to prescribe for management what to do, and so on and so forth. Now, having said that, it's no different from any other underlying general purpose technology, in the sense that we still need to ask the fundamental question around what's the customer problem we are trying to solve, i.e. does this AI technology enable one to provide better customer services, better products and services, and so on and so forth. And that is something that firms may forget in the rush to try to invest and implement AI. We still need to understand where are some of the bottlenecks and where are the improvements from a customer perspective that needs to be implemented, and use AI as a basis of enhancing it, rather than purely for the sake of, we've got lots of data, therefore we need to use AI, and not having a clear view of that customer value proposition, so to speak.
Good. There's another question here. Quite an interesting question too. What practical steps can business leaders take to avoid the efficiency innovation paradox and ensure that the often blind search for efficiencies during times of low business or low consumer confidence, as we're in right now, doesn't kill innovation completely?
Yeah, I think this is such a crucial question, and I think it boils down to some of the softer elements in the firm, and quite often firms tend to focus on the technology per se, but the firms that are able to innovate their business model actually have processes that aligns with the leadership and governance. So the fundamental question we need to ask ourselves is, who owns the business model in organizations? And quite often there is the senior management thinking about strategy formulation, and then there's functional heads trying to improve the efficiency of their particular function or the processes and the activity system. And in the process of doing that, often there's a chasm, i.e. nobody owns the business model. So therefore, there's a tendency to adopt these technologies on a piecemeal level to improve parts of the function or the activities, and therefore nobody owns the business model, and the business model becomes incoherent. What we have seen in large organizations or organizations that have been successful is there needs to be dual ownership, i.e. the senior management needs to own the business model as well as own the function. And sometimes the decision to adopt technologies and transform business model could conflict between what is good for a particular function as opposed to what is good for the firm itself. And therefore, some of these softer issues, what I'm calling some of the intangible capital around ownership of the business model and being able to improve the information capital, the human capital, and the organizational capital, that's what is needed to complement the adoption of digital technologies in order to avoid this efficiency-led approach to technology adoption as opposed to business model or transformation to the business model itself, so to speak.
Okay. So some of the sort of hype elements around AI are automation and robotics adoption. So one question is, what are the implications of automation and robotics adoption on productivity?
Yes, robotics and AI is increasingly being incorporated into robotics, partly because robots are typically used in relatively well-controlled environments, and therefore it's very ripe for AI-enabled robotics, so to speak. And historically, AI has been used in some of the most simpler processes within manufacturing environment and so on and so forth. And what's happening now with AI is we can then incorporate AI into more sophisticated robotics technology, where there is much more variation, so to speak, in the processes. Now, on the one hand, that is excellent. I think that's much needed. It can improve efficiency. It can even provide new customer value propositions and maybe improve even safety features within a manufacturing environment and so on and so forth. However, we get back to the same issue that we talked about earlier, whereby if the firms were to adopt some of these AI-enabled robots and so on and so forth, but not necessarily think about redesigning their overall processes, i.e. there'll still be knock-on effects in terms of how the procurement works, how distribution works, and so on and so forth. And we can see productivity slow down. And quite often, we've seen lots of organizations that adopt robotic technology, and then after a little while, they strip the robots out and get back to the manual process because they haven't seen the benefits coming through, because they haven't redesigned the entire end-to-end value chain. Not only that, we also need to think about what our partner firms are doing, so to speak, i.e. can our partners also be encouraged to adopt some of these robotic technologies so that there is an alignment between our partners as well as our processes, and only then we can really see productivity improvement. And we've seen this based on some of our own work, where if there is a large difference between the robotic and digital technology adoption between firms within a supply chain, we see that the productivity initially increases, and then it turns down when there's increased robotic adoption, because there's a mismatch between the ability of the supply chain partners to be able to engage. And I think that's a very critical element when we think about robotics, specifically with AI, where this cycle around adoption and efficiency would shorten, and therefore it's more important, or it's even more important to think about how the entire supply chain and the processes within the firm can be redesigned.
Now it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about fits large firms very well. But if I'm a small, medium-sized enterprise, and I'm not just a digital startup who's a sort of native company, but if I just have a regular business that isn't all that large, how do I again get beyond this low-hanging fruit that everyone is using? How do I get beyond that low-hanging fruit into sort of really developing a new business innovation model with the technology? What would your advice be?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think with some of these issues that we're talking about probably applies to smaller or small medium-sized enterprises as well. The issue, I suppose, in small medium-sized enterprises is the lack of resources or expertise quite often. Right? So that's one issue. Do we have the understanding to be able to upgrade some of our key processes and so on and so forth? And quite often, I think it's important for firms to start relatively in an experimental stage, so to speak. Can I improve the let's say, the digital knowledge of my staff, so to speak, across the organization, and implement certain processes to remove some of those manual processes, to digitize it, and then think through what are the elements that can be transformed in terms of improving or coming up with new customer value propositions. And that's an important part in firms, the smaller firms, being able to enable their staff to understand some of these technologies, because otherwise there could be a kickback, so to speak, i.e. there could be a resistance to take on some of these new processes. And that is the biggest challenge I think I see in some of these small, medium-sized enterprises compared to larger firms who probably have the knowledge and the resources, but then they implement quickly and get into all of these problems of mismatch and so on and so forth. So I think smaller firms, small, medium-sized firms could also benefit tremendously from some of these technologies. And also sometimes if they're part of a supply chain, to make sure that they work very closely with the supply chain partners in order to ensure that the right type of technology is adopted to enhance the entire end-to-end supply chain, so to speak. So I think that's important.
Yeah, that supply chain thing is quite important, right? Because parallel to this, there's quite a lot of sort of new types of collaboration between firms occurring. Platforms, all sorts of other ways that companies collaborate in the supply chain, but particular platformization is quite important. What are the pros and cons for productivity of participating on those platforms? Sometimes can be complicated, right?
Yes, absolutely. So platforms is an interesting phenomena that has really taken off over the last 15, 20 years or so. And we see very, very large platform-based firms, particularly in the business to consumer sector. Most of these large platforms and the business to consumer, increasingly business to business firms are also adopting some of these platform-based technologies, but they have different type of challenges compared to business to consumer firms, in the sense that because the data is not as easily shared among large corporations compared to a B2C environment where the consumer is quite happy to share the information around their purchase transactions and so on and so forth. Having said that, in the B2C space, there is also increasing tendency for some of these platform firms to become large monopolies because they collect a lot of data and therefore are able to dictate the type of technology some of their ecosystem partners are needing to adopt. And that could also dampen productivity. On the one hand, it increases variety and increases productivity. On the other hand, the monopoly effect could also dampen productivity. And there's an interesting experiment being conducted in India, for example. The Indian government has launched something called the Open Network for Digital Commerce, whereby, and we've been working with this initiative as well, whereby the Indian government has launched an initiative where it allows direct connection between the buyers and sellers through an open network architecture. So therefore, it's a variation. It's very different to a platform because there's no intermediary, and they're making some of this data available more for the public to consume in an anonymized basis. And the intention is to be able to enhance economic growth and productivity and engagement, involvement of small, medium-sized enterprises beyond the city region. And this is a very, very interesting experiment that we need to observe and learn about productivity growth.
Yeah, certainly an interesting thing to watch. And again, in the report that I referred to earlier, there's a reference to this work, which you can read a little bit more about. Time flies when you have an interesting conversation. So we have to go to the last question. And maybe that's a question about very practical when now firms, everybody goes to their day job here. What is your most important advice when you take on AI in your business, when you want to move from that low-hanging fruit, sort of the next level of business model innovation, but also what is the biggest mistake that you see companies make and that you would advise them to avoid or at least mitigate?
Right. I think starting from the second bit of the question, I think the biggest mistakes firms should avoid is this notion that we need to adopt some AI technology because it's available out there. Everybody's doing it. There's a lot of conversation. So and some of these softwares are readily available, and maybe the cost of adoption is relatively low, and hence I need to adopt it for the sake of being able to show that the firm has been AI enabled and so on and so forth. I think that's the biggest mistake. We shouldn't start at that point. What we should do is go back to the basics and say, where exactly are the bottlenecks, i.e. what are the process improvements that need to take place? How is that then going to contribute to new customer value propositions in the firm? And take a step back to ask that question: what business are we in? What's our strategy? How do we do certain things better than our competitors, or provide a new proposition that our competitors are not providing? And then work back from that to say, how would AI enable that proposition to be delivered, and which are the processes that needs to be re-engineered? How do we think about the coherence of the business model, and so on and so forth? I think that's the way in which we can really get the productivity improvement, as opposed to following the herd to say everybody's doing it, therefore I need to do it. And that's the risk, I think, in lots of organizations.
Yeah. Well, really good. Well, this was a high pressure 30-minute lecture in business model innovation. So that's fantastic. Lots of takeaways here, and I'm sure something that people would want to listen to again. Thank you, Chander, for all that. As I mentioned earlier, you can access some of Chander's work in the show notes to this podcast, including the report summarizing the work he has led for the Productivity Institute over the past couple of years, but also some of his other work, and a link to earlier podcasts that Chander has participated in. This webinar will also be posted as a podcast later today. So if you want to listen to it again, as I said, there's a lot of good information here, or you want to advise some of your colleagues to listen to it, please let them know. Tomorrow's Ask the Expert will be again on the topic of digital technologies. We can't get enough of this because it's such an important topic for productivity, but we'll take a bit more of an economic, a public policy perspective. And we do that with another colleague of ours at the University of Cambridge, Professor Diane Coyle at the Bennett School for Public Policy. So we hope you will join us again. And as mentioned, for all the other information on National Productivity Week, go to our website, specific dedicated website, productivityweek.co.uk. And meanwhile, you can also sign up for the entire Productivity Puzzle series for your favorite platform to make sure you also don't miss any future episodes. Productivity Puzzles was brought to you by the Productivity Institute. This was me again, Bart van Ark at the Productivity Institute. Thanks for listening and have a productive day.
Well, I think National Productivity Week is a really good opportunity to highlight the importance of productivity, and we work very closely with the Productivity Institute. We help them to develop better measures, to develop policy to improve productivity.
So I was keen to be involved in National Productivity Week because I feel that productivity is the #1 policy agenda for the UK, and the opportunity to kind of speak with policymakers, researchers and think tanks and how we might be able to contribute to that agenda was one I was really passionate about.
Well, I want to be involved in National Productivity Week because it's hugely important for our members here in Wales that we improve productivity and we raise our game, because the benefits by improved productivity in Wales will be manifold, and we'll only see those in the long term. But we've got to start now.
A profitable business will, generally speaking, be a productive one. And when people need to think about how to improve their profits or improve the conditions for their workforce, productivity is the first place to look.
Organisations really need to encourage an openness to listen to ideas from all parts, and that is a challenging thing to do. You're going to have to be open, you're going to have to write things down that maybe you don't believe. But making sure that psychological safety is in place is essential for innovation.
I think it is every part of the organisation doing their part and ensuring that everybody has their moment or place to communicate their ideas in the right way.
Wales lies below the UK average, but there are opportunities for us to catch up. And we've set out an agenda today as part of the event, which hopefully will raise the profile of that productivity challenge and start us thinking about positive actions to take to improve productivity in Wales.
An organization might have an established way of doing things, it might have an established business model, and to introduce an innovation to that is to take a risk, and it also means abandoning something that people are very committed to.
You need to see the impact of innovation on growth, prosperity, and also how interesting it is to work, because you have better jobs, more interesting jobs. You're trying to conquer the world, and more and more people then try to do that.
If policy is not changed, productivity will continue to go down. And I think this is because of things like lack of innovation, low skills.
I think the biggest productivity challenge for businesses is really thinking about how it can make the best of new technologies and how that could be diffused throughout the whole economy.